Hello everyone, today we are going to be talking about the Chigorin Defense, which happens after d4, d5, c4, and now knight to c6. We'll be looking at all the main lines that you need to know to play this opening, and we'll also cover the tactical themes that occur in this line. Now, first of all, I need to address the idea that many of you guys might be thinking, which is, well, can't this c-pawn now never move? And as many of you know, against d4 and c4, you want to play either c5 or c6, depending on your playing style, but you need to use your c-pawn to cut into the center at some point. So going knight to c6 seems really counterproductive because you're not going to be able to get the same control in the center with pawns. However, the knight on c6 does allow you to do many things that normally does not happen when you play, for instance, knight to f6 or e6 in this position. One of those things is that this idea of e5 now becomes possible, and as you will see from the lines that I show later in this video, e5 is a move that you play very, very often in this line, and it's a great way for you to get the initiative in the center. Additionally, there's quite a lot of pressure on d4. Now, why is this important? Well, pretend they waste a move and play a6. Well, now we can take. Now, typically, white plays e4 here, and then they regain the pawn and they have a huge center, but of course, e4 here is a huge blunder. Now, we're simply going to be a clean pawn up. And so, they have to play e3, and in general, white's going to have to be a lot more conservative when it comes to the center because this knight is so well placed. And so, for those two reasons, and also the fact that sometimes, not in the main lines that I show you today, but still something to keep in mind, you can formulate with this knight some attack on this square here on c2. That is sometimes possible. You do have to be worried sometimes about this queen check. But let's say you castle in the future when you develop your bishop. That could be an idea, so another thing to keep in mind. But mainly these two ideas of attacking d4 and preparing e5, the knight is super well placed and you do get your control in the center, not with pawns necessarily, but with this really nicely placed knight. So now let's start to talk about the theoretical continuations from this position. Now white has a few options. They can take on the center. They can play a move like e3, which is a huge main line, and their idea is to play very safe, very solid, and simply defend their pawn. Or they can develop either one of their knights. Usually this will transpose because they end up just developing both of their knights. Now these three playing styles we will all address in the video today. Let's start with what happens if they take. Now after they take, we play queen takes, of course. Now here, there's a few options. Knight to c3 obviously blunders the pawn. Again, a huge point of the knight being here. It's really well placed to attack the pawn on d4. So alternatively, they can try a move like knight to f3 and defend the pawn this way. However, here we can do a few things. Bishop g4 is not so strong here as it is in other positions because of the move knight to c3. So alternatively, we can play e5, and our idea is to now meet knight to c3 with bishop to b4. So to demonstrate what this might look like, well, if they take, we take, and then take, and after they develop their knight, we can first develop our bishop, but ultimately pin their knight, castle at some point. Notice this entire time we're adding pressure to their center, and our pieces are developing really nicely. Now here we can castle. You can also play f5 here, just go a little crazy because of course the king probably will not go short. Instead, you're going to castle long, also put some pressure on the d-file. The key characteristic of this opening is the immense pressure that you have on the center, which is something that doesn't typically happen. Usually white is calling the shots in the center, but here clearly we have a lot of pressure on e4. The knight also can eventually attack e4, same with the bishop, and once we castle, of course, the rook as well. So we just have really good play in this position. So that's something that can happen. Now, of course, after queen takes d5 in this line, they can also just play e3, for example. And here we can continue with e5. Again, this thematic idea of breaking open the center. If they were to take, then we can do a number of things. We can take their queen first, misplace their king, and then capture back. We can even consider capturing here immediately. There's a number of moves in this position. We can throw in a check as well, but generally speaking, depending on our playing style, we're going to find a position that suits our needs here. And so for that reason, white typically instead decides to develop. This is a main line, but here we pin the knight. And again, we get to these positions where their knights develop and we simply pin them. These bishops find really good and active locations. Another characteristic of this opening, because we've blasted through in the center with both of our pawns, so these bishops have really good scope. And after something like bishop e2, we develop our knight. Someone tried bishop d2 here in a game in my database, and we can simply take again, and we get this really simplified position where after takes, well, if they take with the knight here, then they lose g2. So here, queen takes d4 is played, and now after bishop takes f3, we have this nice tactic where the bishop defends the queen. So if queen takes, bishop takes. So instead, bishop takes f3, and now queen takes. And after castles, we're really happy here. We're defending the pawn. This pawn is weak. And this is just a really golden position for us. And so all of this is to show that if they try to take in the center immediately with c takes d5, this doesn't typically work out because we get really good play by playing e5, by developing the bishops, eventually castling, and we have great control in the center. So what are their alternatives? Well, one thing they can try is knight to f3 in this position. And their idea with this move is to just develop both knights, play this like any other position, really. Now here we can continue with something like bishop g4, again, putting pressure on the knight immediately. Now if they play queen to b3, I just want to throw this in just to show you one of the nice features of this position. Queen b3 is something that often you're afraid of because when the bishop comes out, we lose sight on b7. But in this opening specifically, it's almost never something to be afraid of because here we can take, for example, and it doesn't matter what they take with. Let's say pawn takes, we end up winning the pawn on d4 with also the threat of this fork. This is simply really crushing. So just I want to mention, don't be scared when you develop your light square bishop of queen b3 because we have a lot of pressure in the center and we're going to get a lot of compensation if they go for this pawn. So instead of queen b3, let's say knight to c3, simply continuing their plan. Here we can play e6. Notice going e5 doesn't work out here. The issue is their knights are really powerful here. And as a general rule of thumb, if they only control the center with pawns, then we break with e5, or if we have nice pins going. But when they develop their knights and they prioritize developing their knights, e5 is less effective because they have really good control in the center. But instead, we can simply play e6, for example, and we solidify our center. We look to develop. This is just a totally fine position for us. If they take, we take with the pawn. Let's say bishop f4, bishop d6, bishop g3. I'm following a game here. And you can see black has totally fine play. We castle. Again, queen b3, not so scary. We can even go queen to d7 here after we take and go queen d7 just to wreck their structure, of course. And if they get greedy and take on b7, well, first of all, we have this very common idea of winning back the pawn, but another characteristic of this opening specifically, there's also this nice move, knight to b4, another nice tactical theme when they get greedy and go for the pawn. If we can't win this pawn, we can also go knight b4, threatening the fork. And if they try to defend it, well, we also had another threat of going rook to b8 and now trapping their queen because the knight very conveniently controls over a6. So this would be a disaster. They'd have to give away their queen for a rook here. So none of this really works for white that well. And if they don't play this, let's say they just develop normally, then we do the same. We develop our queen. We can play h6 at some point. I mean, this is a totally playable position for both sides. We have this knight jump that always is a little annoying, especially if they try to set up something like this going along this diagonal. Knight b4 might hit them in a very bad spot. And generally speaking, black has no issues in this position whatsoever. So they can try to take here. They can try to develop both of their knights. None of those options are really scary. Let's quickly cover e3 as well, because this is actually one of their most popular choices at all levels. Simply staying solid and now saying, well, after you take, will take. And it's true we didn't get this e4 center like we wanted, but, well, we have no weaknesses as well. This pawn is really well defended, and we have a good position. So we don't take. We don't follow their plans. Instead, we go e5. And again, this characteristic of the position of going e5 when they don't control the center with knights very heavily, e5 is an incredibly nice resource. And this is a perfect example. Why? Because if they take, first of all, on d5, I should mention, we simply take with the queen, and after knight to c3, we pin their knight. Let's say they unpin, we can even take. And we're not even opposed to going into this endgame because they're going to have this really weak pawn. And from here, we simply develop our bishop somewhere, develop our knight, castle somewhere, probably long to keep pressure on the pawn, and we have no problems. We've absolutely equalized. Maybe we're even fighting for an edge here because this pawn is so weak on d4. So that would be definitely possible. And let's say instead, after c takes d5, we take, or after e5, rather, they don't play c takes d5, and they take instead on e5 with d takes e5. Well, here also we don't have problems. We have this very nice thematic d4. And this one you do have to remember, because otherwise, if you also let them take here when their queen's defending, that's going to be a nightmare. So you play d5 here. And the threat is quite annoying, which is bishop b4. Let's say they just develop normally with knight to f3, bishop b4. And after bishop d2, we have this very nice trap that occurs in some other lines, but also in this opening as well, which is this move taking on e3. And if they take here, of course we take also on f2. If king takes, we win their queen. So they have to go king to e2, but after takes, and takes, we're simply up material. These pawns are extremely weak. This pawn is really strong, and it's going to take white some moves to get rid of it. This is a golden position for us. And so after here, they have to play something like f takes, but even this is not so perfect. We take, and then we play something like bishop g4. We take on d8 with the rook, and we have no issues here as well. They develop their knight, and we do the same. We can play knight to e7 at some point. We can, of course, whenever we want, cash in on the material. These pawns are just really flimsy. They're not going to survive at all. And so this line really proves the power of d4. Now, one last line to mention. After we get in d4, their best move is a3 to stop any sort of shenanigans with bishop b4. But this doesn't really bother us. We simply develop knight e7. There's also an interesting line with a5. If you're interested in gaining some space on the queen side, you can investigate this line, but I don't see an issue with knight to e7. Just developing, let's say knight f3, we pin. Again, the second the knight shows up, we pin it. This is a huge commonality in all of these lines in the Chigorin defense. We can pin the knight and get really good development for our bishop. Let's say bishop e2, we can take at some point. Bishop takes, we can even trade all the queens and castle long. We have really good play here. And once again, why? Because their pawns are so weak. These pawns are really weak. When we get in e5 and they take and we push, both of these pawns are left really undefended. At some point we can take here and then take. The only thing I would be careful about this one is we give them two pretty powerful bishops. So, for example, a7 might become a little weak. And so alternatively, we can try to take maybe with the knights. We can develop our bishop at some point and trade the bishops, and then we can take so they don't have the two bishops. But we can find some solution to this problem, and we have a really decent position because of their weaknesses. So overall, the Chigorin is a really good opening. We get really easy development for all of our pieces, and a lot of times, when you play e6, you sacrifice the development of this light square bishop. Also often c6, and then the later e6, we don't really develop this bishop often. Or sometimes even this bishop has a little trouble if we play maybe setups based around d6. And so the point is, it's very rare that all of our pieces get into the game so powerfully and so early on. But this opening with knight to c6 after d5, c4, and knight c6 is a really good way to do that. We break with e5, develop our pieces to really active squares, and we really have no issues whatsoever. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Subscribe if you're new around here, and I will see you next time. Peace out.